You went to get a quote on a deck addition last spring. The contractor came out, measured everything, seemed reasonable enough, and then handed you a number that nearly made you spit out your coffee. You thought the guy was out of his mind. But here's the thing. He probably wasn't padding it. He wasn't taking you for a ride. That number was real. And if you'd gotten 3 more quotes, they all would have come back somewhere in the same painful neighborhood. That's not a contractor problem. That's a lumber problem. And if you don't understand what's been happening with lumber prices over the last few years, you are going to keep getting blindsided by renovation budgets that feel completely disconnected from reality. Hit subscribe before we begin, because this is one of those topics I'm going to keep coming back to as things keep shifting. I'm Jerry Davis. I've spent decades in the building and renovation industry, framing houses, managing renovations, working alongside contractors, lumber yards, and real homeowners who are just trying to improve their properties without getting taken apart financially. And I've watched the lumber market do things in recent years that nobody in this business saw coming, and nobody has fully explained to the people who are actually paying for it. That's what we're doing today. I want you to walk away from this video knowing exactly what happened, why your renovation costs jumped the way they did, what contractors are actually dealing with on their end, and most importantly, what you can do right now to protect yourself and your budget. Because this isn't over. This market is not settled. And if you're planning any kind of addition, deck, framing work, or renovation that touches structural wood, you need to understand what you're walking into. Let me give you some context first. Before the pandemic, lumber was relatively stable and predictable. Contractors could quote a job, lock in material costs, and generally hold those numbers for a reasonable window of time. That's how the whole estimating process is supposed to work. Then, everything fell apart. Sawmills cut production during the early pandemic slowdown. Then, demand exploded because everyone was home looking at their space, deciding to finally build that deck or finish that basement. Mills couldn't ramp back up fast enough. Supply tanked, demand surged, and lumber futures hit numbers that looked like a misprint. We're talking prices that went from roughly $350 to $400 per thousand board feet, all the way up past $1,700 at one point. That's not a price increase. That's a different reality. Now, things did come back down from those peak numbers, but here's what a lot of homeowners missed. They saw the headlines saying lumber prices dropped and assumed things went back to normal. They didn't. By late 2024, framing lumber composite prices were still running around 17% higher than the prior year. Going into 2026, you're looking at pricing that bounces between $500 and $870 per thousand board feet, depending on the week, the region, and what Canadian mills are doing. And that brings me to the tariff issue, because this is where it gets even messier. Canada supplies a massive share of the softwood lumber used in American construction. We're talking about the SPF lumber, that's spruce, pine, and fir, that frames the majority of homes built in this country. There's a 14.54% tariff on that material right now. That's adding somewhere between $60 and $70 per thousand board feet, just in tariff costs. Every 2x4 that comes across that border is already carrying a tax burden before it ever hits a lumber yard or a job site. Now, let me explain why this hits you, the homeowner, harder than you might think. Wood framing accounts for roughly 18% of total construction costs on most residential projects. That sounds manageable until you do the math on a full addition or a major renovation. If you're putting on a room addition, finishing a basement with proper framing, adding a 2-car garage, or doing a full deck build, lumber isn't just a line item. It's one of the biggest ones. And when that line item swings 20 or 30% in either direction, depending on when you start your project, the entire budget changes. Contractors aren't magicians. They can't absorb a 20% material spike and still honor a quote they gave you 3 months ago. That's not them being dishonest. That's math. Here's what no one tells you. A lot of the friction between homeowners and contractors right now isn't about bad work or bad character. It's about timing. The contractor who quoted your deck in January might have priced lumber at one number. By the time the permit cleared and the crew was ready to start in April, the material cost had moved. Now, he's either eating that difference, asking you to split it, or renegotiating the contract. And if you never understood why lumber prices fluctuate the way they do, that conversation feels like a bait and switch. It isn't. It's just a market that doesn't stay still. So here's what you should actually do before you start any project that involves framing, structural lumber, or even large deck builds. First, ask your contractor specifically when they purchased or plan to purchase the lumber for your job. Some contractors will pre-buy materials and lock in a price. Some won't. If they're not locking in material costs early, your quote has exposure. Ask them to put a material escalation clause in the contract, or an anti-escalation clause, which basically says the price you agreed to is the price, period, and they're responsible for managing that risk. Some contractors will agree, some won't, but asking the question tells you a lot about how experienced and organized they are. Second, think hard about project timing. Lumber prices tend to have seasonal patterns. Late fall and early winter historically see softer demand from construction, and prices can ease a bit. Spring and early summer are peak construction season, and demand pushes prices up. Planning a framing project for November instead of April could save you real money. Not because lumber magically gets cheaper, but because you're not competing with every other contractor and developer trying to get material at the same time. Third, and this one is important, don't assume engineered lumber is automatically going to save you money just because it sounds more modern. LVL beams, engineered floor systems, I-joists, they all have their place and they do a great job. But they're not immune to price swings either. Engineered wood products have had their own supply issues. I've seen LVL beam costs jump 30 to 40% in a short window. Don't go into a contractor meeting assuming engineered means cheaper. Ask for pricing on both options and compare them based on your actual project. Now, let's talk about something that really drives me nuts, because I see it constantly. Homeowners make a renovation decision based on a budget number they heard from a neighbor or saw in an online article, then walk into a contractor meeting completely unprepared for current reality. That article that said a deck addition costs $15,000. That might have been written in 2021 or 2022, when lumber was at a different point in the cycle. A $10,000 deck project today could legitimately run $12,000 to $13,000 just from material increases. And that's before labor, permits, hardware, or any complexity in the design. I'm not saying contractors can't be dishonest. Some are. But a lot of homeowners are coming in with outdated price expectations, and then assuming the contractor is gouging them when the real problem is their reference point is 2 or 3 years old. Here's a pro tip. Before you get any contractor quotes on a lumber-heavy project, go to your local lumberyard, not a big box store, an actual lumberyard, and ask them for current pricing on 2x4S, 2x6S, 2x10 framing lumber, and whatever sheet goods you think you'll need. They'll usually talk to you. You won't get wholesale pricing as a homeowner, but you'll get a real sense of where the market is sitting right now. Then, when a contractor gives you a quote, you can do a rough sanity check on whether the material portion of their estimate is in the ballpark. This doesn't make you a builder. It makes you a smarter buyer. Let me talk about what happens when homeowners try to cut corners on lumber quality to save money, because this is a mistake I see turn into expensive problems later. There's structural lumber, and then there's whatever happens to be in the stack at the discount bin. When a contractor grabs cheap, low-grade framing lumber to save a few $100s on a quote, what you end up with is boards that bow, twist, and warp, walls that won't stay plumb, floors that squeak and bounce. It sounds minor. It isn't. Warped framing members telegraph, through drywall, through flooring, through trim. That small, invisible decision in the wall cavity creates visible, frustrating problems in the finished room for as long as you own the house. Always ask your contractor what grade of lumber they're specifying. The answer should be no, 2 or better on structural framing. If they can't answer that question clearly, that's a red flag. Don't get me wrong, I understand that every homeowner is working with a real budget. I'm not standing here telling you to spend money you don't have. But there's a difference between making a smart budget choice and making a cheap one that costs you more in 3 years. Framing is not the place to cut corners. Framing is the skeleton of your home. Once it's in the wall for decades. Now let's talk about the design side of this, because the lumber crisis has also pushed a lot of contractors and homeowners towards simplifying structural design. And sometimes that's fine, and sometimes it's a mistake. Open floor plans are popular, and I get it. They feel spacious and modern. But removing bearing walls and installing big open spans requires serious engineering, larger headers, and often some form of engineered beam product that has its own cost. I've seen homeowners push for a wide open great room concept, get sticker shock on the structural cost, and then push the contractor to find a cheaper way to do it. Here's where that gets dangerous. Load-bearing walls exist for a reason. If you take one out, something has to carry that load. If the something that carries it is undersized because someone was trying to save $800 on a beam, you've now built a structural problem into your house. And structural problems don't go away. They grow. The other thing I want to address is pre-buying material. Some homeowners have started buying their own lumber and supplying it to contractors as a way to control costs and cut out any contractor markup. I understand the logic, and sometimes it works. But more often than not, it creates headaches. Contractors typically have relationships with lumber yards and are buying at contractor pricing, which is lower than what you'll get walking in off the street. They also know exactly what grade, species, and dimensions they need for your specific job. If you buy the wrong material, wrong size, wrong grade, wrong moisture content, the contractor isn't responsible for what they build with it. And now you've created both a liability gap and a potential structural issue. If you want to try this approach, do it in close coordination with your contractor, not as a surprise on delivery day. And speaking of moisture content, this is something almost no one talks to homeowners about, and it matters a lot, especially right now when lumber supply chains have been stressed and material is sitting in yards longer or coming from different sources than usual. Framing lumber that hasn't been properly dried will shrink and move after it's installed. That movement causes drywall cracks, nail pops, squeaky floors, and trim gaps. It's not catastrophic structural failure, but it is the kind of thing that makes a new addition or renovation look cheap and feel sloppy within the first year. Ask your contractor if the lumber they're using is kiln dried. It should be. The abbreviation on the grade stamp is KD or KDATT. If they look at you like you asked them a strange question, that's information. Here's the bottom line on all of this. The lumber market is not done moving around. Tariffs are still in play, Canadian mill capacity is still an issue, and housing demand in this country is climbing. Projections for 2026 suggest we could stay in a volatile pricing band for the foreseeable future. That doesn't mean you can't renovate. It means you have to renovate smarter than you used to. Lock in material costs early. Understand what's in your contractor's quote. Know the grade of lumber being used on your job. Plan your project timeline with pricing cycles in mind. And stop using renovation cost estimates from articles or neighbors that are 2 or 3 years old, because that number is wrong and using it will set you up for disappointment every single time. Tell me in the comments which part of this surprised you the most. Was it the tariff piece, the grading issue, the seasonal pricing? Because I guarantee at least one of these things is going to hit differently once you actually sit down with a contractor for your next project. At the end of the day, Lumber is just wood. But right now, it's expensive, it's complicated, and it's sitting in the middle of almost every renovation budget you're trying to plan. Understanding it doesn't make you a builder. It makes you someone who doesn't get blindsided. And that's worth a lot more than any amount of money you'll save chasing a discount. If this helped you, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's about to start a renovation and has no idea what they're walking into. I'll catch you in the next one.